Margaret Chen sat in the sterile waiting room of County General Hospital, her hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm coffee she had no intention of drinking. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly pale glow. Around her, other people waited, some anxious, some bored, all trapped in that peculiar limbo of hospital time where minutes stretched like hours. It was 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. Margaret was 62 years old, and her husband of 40 years. David was in emergency surgery after a massive heart attack. The doctor had used words like critical and uncertain and prepare yourself. Margaret had nodded, signed forms, answered questions, all while feeling like she was moving through water. Everything slow and distant and unreal. Now, in the waiting room, the shock was wearing off, and reality was crashing in. David might die. David might actually die. Tonight. Right now. While she sat here with this stupid cup of coffee she couldn't seem to put down, she needed someone. She needed her best friend. With shaking hands, Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang once. Twice. 3 times. Then, voicemail. You've reached Linda Patterson. I can't come to the phone right now, but leave a message and I'll get back to you. The cheerful voice felt like a slap. Margaret tried to keep her voice steady. Linda, it's Margaret. I'm at County General. David had a heart attack. He's in surgery. I don't know if... I really need you. Please call me back. She hung up and stared at the phone, willing it to ring. It didn't. Margaret and Linda had been best friends for 32 years. They'd met when their children were in the same kindergarten class, bonded over terrible school fundraisers and the chaos of raising kids. They'd been there for each other through everything: teenage rebellions, aging parents, career changes, health scares. They talked every day, sometimes twice a day. They knew each other's secrets, fears, dreams. Linda was the sister Margaret never had, the person who understood her better than anyone except David. Surely Linda would call back any minute now. Margaret waited. She checked her phone obsessively, making sure the ringer was on, that she had signal, that the battery wasn't dead. She texted, Linda, please. I really need you. An hour passed. Then 2. The sun began to rise, pale light filtering through the waiting room windows. Margaret's phone remained silent. At 6:23 a.m., a surgeon in green scrubs emerged. Margaret stood on legs that didn't quite feel like her own. Mrs. Chen? Your husband made it through surgery. The next 48 hours are critical, but we're cautiously optimistic. Margaret burst into tears, relief and fear and exhaustion all tangled together. The surgeon patted her shoulder awkwardly and disappeared back through the double doors. Margaret looked at her phone again. Nothing. She called Linda again. Voicemail. She called Linda's home phone. No answer. She texted again. David made it through surgery. Where are you? Silence. Over the next 3 days, as David lay in the ICU connected to machines that beeped and hissed, as Margaret kept vigil in an uncomfortable chair, as doctors gave updates and nurses changed shifts, as Margaret's daughter flew in from Seattle and her son drove up from San Diego, Linda never called back. Not once. Margaret left 4 more messages. She sent 6 more texts. She even drove by Linda's house on her way home one night to grab clean clothes. Linda's car was in the driveway. Lights on in the windows. Linda was home. Linda was just not answering. On the 4th day, when David was finally stable enough to be moved out of ICU, Margaret sat in the hospital cafeteria with a tray of food she couldn't eat and tried Linda's number one more time. This time, Linda answered. Hello? Linda's voice was cautious, almost cold. Linda. Margaret felt a rush of relief so powerful it made her dizzy. Oh my God, I've been trying to reach you for days! Did you get my messages? David had a heart attack. He's stable now, but it was so scary and I really needed... I got your messages, Linda interrupted. Silence. You got them? Margaret's mind struggled to process this. But you didn't call back. I thought maybe your phone was broken, or... My phone works fine, Margaret. Another silence. This one, heavier, darker. I don't understand, Margaret said, her voice small. David almost died. I needed my best friend. And you, why didn't you call me back? Linda sighed, the sound sharp with irritation. Margaret, I've been dealing with a lot. I can't drop everything every time you have a crisis. The words hit like a physical blow. Every time? Crisis? David's heart attack was a crisis. Not drama. Not an overreaction. Linda, what are you talking about? I don't ask you for much, and this was an emergency. My husband almost died. I'm glad he's okay, Linda said, her tone perfunctory, as if she were checking off a box. But I can't be your emotional support system anymore, Margaret. I have my own life, my own problems. I know you do, and I've been there for all of them. When Richard left you, who sat with you every night for 3 months? When your mother died, who helped you plan the funeral? When you lost your job, who? That's different. How is it different? It just is. Look, I need to go. I'm glad David's okay. Take care. And Linda hung up. Margaret stared at her phone, the words call ended, mocking her from the screen. Her best friend of 32 years had just hung up on her. During the worst week of her life. What had just happened? Over the next 2 weeks, as David slowly recovered and came home, as their children returned to their own lives, as Margaret tried to establish some new normal of cardiac diets and medication schedules and follow-up appointments, she couldn't stop thinking about Linda's cold dismissal. She replayed their last real conversation before David's heart attack. It had been normal. They talked about a new restaurant they wanted to try, complained about their aching knees, laughed about a ridiculous thing Linda's grandson had said. Nothing had seemed wrong. But now, looking back with this new, painful clarity, Margaret began to see cracks she'd missed before. Linda had been different lately. More distant, maybe. Harder to pin down for their usual coffee dates. Less responsive in their text conversations. Small things Margaret had dismissed at the time, attributing them to Linda being busy or having an off week. When had it started? Margaret tried to trace it back. 3 months ago? 4? She remembered a dinner party at Linda's house in August. Margaret had mentioned that David was being considered for a promotion. Nothing major. Just a step up at his consulting firm before he retired. Linda had smiled and said, "That's nice," but there'd been something in her tone, something off. Then there was the time Margaret had sent Linda photos from their anniversary trip to Napa Valley, a surprise David had planned. Linda's response had been a single word. Nice. In the week Margaret had been excited about their daughter Emma's engagement, bubbling over with wedding planning talk, Linda had suddenly had to cut their phone call short. "I have to go, Margaret. I'll call you later." She hadn't called. Margaret had noticed these moments but hadn't connected them into a pattern. Now sitting in her quiet house while David napped upstairs, she forced herself to look at the pattern honestly. Her best friend had been pulling away, and Margaret had no idea why. She tried calling Linda again. Voicemail. She texted, "Linda, please talk to me. I don't understand what's happening. What did I do wrong?" 2 days later, Linda finally responded, "You didn't do anything wrong. I just need some space right now." Space. From a 32-year friendship. During the hardest time of Margaret's life, Margaret's daughter Emma called that evening to check on David. "How are you holding up, Mom?" "I'm fine," Margaret said automatically, then found herself adding, "Actually, no, I'm not fine. Something's wrong with Linda." She told Emma everything. The unanswered calls, the cold phone conversation, the request for space. Emma was quiet for a moment. "Mom, I don't want to upset you, especially right now, but Linda's been weird for a while. I noticed it at your birthday party in June." "What do you mean?" "She seemed, I don't know, jealous? You were talking about the European river cruise you and Dad were planning for next year, and her face just sort of shut down. And when people were toasting you, she left the room." Margaret's mind raced back to her birthday party. Had Linda left during the toasts? She'd been so busy talking to guests, she hadn't noticed. "And remember last year when you won that award from your professional association?" Emma continued. "Linda barely congratulated you. I thought I was weird at the time. Margaret did remember. She'd been honored as Volunteer of the Year for her work with literacy programs. It had meant a lot to her. Linda had sent a text. Congrats. No exclamation point, no enthusiasm, nothing like the effusive celebrations Linda usually offered for any good news. Why didn't you say something? Margaret asked. Because you seemed so happy, and I thought maybe I was reading too much into it. But Mom, I think Linda might be jealous of you. Of your life. That's ridiculous. Why would she be jealous? We're friends. You celebrate your friends' happiness. You'd think so, Emma said softly. But not everyone does. After they hung up, Margaret sat in the darkness of her living room, David's soft snoring drifting down from upstairs, and forced herself to consider what Emma had suggested. Linda? Jealous? Of what? Margaret mentally compared their lives. They were both 62. Both retired. Linda from teaching, Margaret from her work as a librarian. Both had adult children and grandchildren. Both had been married for decades, though Linda's husband Richard had left her 5 years ago for a younger woman. A betrayal that had devastated Linda and that Margaret had helped her through. Oh, Margaret's marriage was intact. Loving, even. 40 years later, Linda's had ended in humiliation. Margaret and David had financial security, not wealthy, but comfortable, able to plan trips and help their kids and not worry about every expense. Linda, after the divorce, had struggled financially. She'd had to sell the house, downsize to a small condo, watch every penny. Margaret's children lived close, Emma in Seattle, just a few hours away, and James in San Diego, an easy flight. They visited often. Linda's daughter had moved to London years ago and rarely came home. Her son lived 2 hours away but was distant, caught up in his own life. Margaret and David had plans. The river cruise, a trip to Japan they'd been talking about, weekend getaways. Linda had mentioned once, bitterly, that she couldn't afford to travel anymore. And the award Margaret had won. How many times had Linda applied for similar recognition and been passed over? Margaret felt sick. Was Emma right? Had Linda been watching Margaret's life? Her intact marriage? Her financial security? Her close family? Her accolades? And feeling resentment build with each happy moment Margaret shared? But that couldn't be the whole explanation. They'd been best friends for 32 years. You didn't abandon someone during a medical crisis because you were jealous. That wasn't how friendship worked. Margaret tried calling Linda again. Linda, please. If I did something wrong, tell me. If you're upset about something, let's talk about it. You're my best friend. I need to understand what's happening. Linda's response came via text an hour later. I'm not upset. I just need space. Please respect that. Space. That word again. As if decades of friendship could be paused like a subscription service. As if Margaret's need during a crisis was an imposition Linda could simply opt out of. Margaret put her phone down and cried. Really cried. For the first time since David's heart attack. She'd held it together through the emergency, through the surgery, through the scary days in ICU. She'd been strong for David, for her kids, for everyone. But this betrayal, and that's what it was, she could admit now, a betrayal. This broke something in her. As David's recovery continued over the following weeks, Margaret found herself doing something she'd never done before. Questioning everything about her friendship with Linda. She pulled out old photo albums, scrolled through years of text messages and emails, mentally reviewing 3 decades of shared history. And slowly, painfully, a different picture began to emerge. Had the friendship always been as mutual as Margaret had believed? She thought about all the times she'd been there for Linda. When Richard left, Margaret had spent months as Linda's primary support system. Daily phone calls, weekly dinners, endless conversations processing the betrayal. When Linda's mother died, Margaret had helped arrange the funeral, sorted through the estate, held Linda while she cried. When Linda lost her teaching job during budget cuts, Margaret had helped rewrite her resume, practiced interview questions with her, connected her with people who might have opportunities. Margaret had shown up. Always. Without question. But when Margaret tried to remember times Linda had shown up for her, the memories were hazier, fewer. When Margaret's father had died 10 years ago, Linda had come to the funeral but left early, saying she wasn't good with grief. When Margaret had struggled through a difficult period of depression 8 years ago, Linda had listened for a few weeks, and then started changing the subject whenever Margaret brought up her feelings. When Margaret had been stressed about her mother's declining health, Linda had offered sympathy, but had never actually helped. No visits to the nursing home. No breaks to give Margaret rest. Just words of support that never translated to action. Margaret had told herself at the time that people expressed friendship differently, that Linda showed love in other ways, that her presence was enough. But was it? Had it ever been? She thought about their conversations. How much of their talk had been about Linda's problems, Linda's feelings, Linda's life? Margaret tried to remember the last time Linda had asked how she was doing and really listened to the answer. Weeks? Months? She remembered a conversation from last year. Margaret had mentioned she was worried about some test results from her annual physical. Linda had said, "I'm sure it's fine," and immediately pivoted to talking about her own health concerns. The tests had come back fine, but Margaret remembered feeling strangely alone, even in the middle of their phone call. There was the time Margaret had been excited about starting a writing class, something she'd wanted to do for years. She'd told Linda all about it, the teacher she admired, the stories she wanted to write. Linda had listened for maybe 5 minutes before interrupting with, "That's nice. Hey, did I tell you about the fight I had with my daughter?" Small moments. Individually, they meant nothing. Collectively, they painted a picture of a friendship where Margaret gave and Linda received, where Margaret's role was to support and Linda's role was to be supported. But Margaret had never minded before. She was a nurturer by nature. She liked helping people. She liked being needed. Except now, when she needed support herself, Linda had disappeared. Margaret's friend Diane from her book club stopped by with a casserole one afternoon. Diane was a pleasant acquaintance, someone Margaret enjoyed but wasn't particularly close to. "How's David doing?" Diane asked, settling into the living room with tea. "He's improving every day, thank God. The doctor is really pleased with his progress." "And how are you doing? This must have been terrifying." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. It was such a simple question. "I'm okay. It's been hard." "I bet. Is Linda being helpful?" "I know you two are close." The tears spilled over. Margaret hadn't planned to talk about Linda, but suddenly everything came pouring out. The unanswered calls, the cold phone conversation, the request for space, the 32 years of friendship that had apparently meant nothing when Margaret actually needed something. Diane listened quietly, her face growing more concerned. When Margaret finished, Diane was silent for a moment. "Can I tell you something?" Diane finally said. "I've watched your friendship with Linda for years. We're in the same yoga class, we see each other at community events. And I've noticed things." "What things?" "The way she talks about you when you're not there. It's not always kind. She makes little comments, subtle digs. About your marriage, about your kids, about your life. Nothing big enough that anyone would call her on it, but enough that I've wondered." Margaret felt cold. "What kind of comments?" "Like when someone mentions you're doing well, she'll say something like, 'Some people have all the luck,' or 'must be nice,' in this tone that's just off. Or she'll bring up something you're struggling with, make it sound bigger than it is. Last year, when you mentioned you were worried about your memory, just normal aging stuff we all deal with, she told people you were really declining and not quite yourself anymore." "She what?" "I assumed you knew and didn't care. I thought maybe that was just your friendship dynamic. But seeing how upset you are now, I don't think you knew at all." Margaret's mind reeled. Linda had been talking about her behind her back? Undermining her? For how long? Why didn't anyone tell me? Diane looked uncomfortable. "Because we assumed you knew. Because it seemed like such a close friendship from the outside that we figured if Linda was saying those things, maybe they were true. Or maybe you were okay with it." "I'm sorry, Margaret. I should have said something." After Diane left, Margaret sat alone in her house, feeling like everything she'd believed about her most important friendship was a lie. Had she been blind? Or had Linda been that good at hiding her true feelings? She thought about the concept of a frenemy, someone who pretended to be a friend but was actually competitive, jealous, even hostile. She'd always thought those were dramatic creations of TV shows and movies. Real adult friendships weren't like that. Except maybe they were. Maybe hers had been. Margaret started paying attention in a new way. She joined a grief support group. Not because David had died, but because she was grieving the loss of a friendship that had, in many ways, already been dead without her realizing it. In the support group, she met other women who'd experienced similar betrayals. The stories were eerily similar. Carolyn, 65, whose best friend of 40 years had stopped talking to her when Carolyn's son became successful. She said she was happy for us, but every time I mentioned him, she'd get this look on her face. Then one day she just stopped returning my calls. Janet, 60, whose closest friend had abandoned her during her breast cancer treatment. She said she couldn't handle seeing me sick. She said it was too hard for her. Ruth, 68, whose friend group had iced her out after she inherited money from an aunt. They didn't need me anymore once I couldn't commiserate about money problems. It's a specific kind of betrayal, the group leader, a therapist named Dr. Sandra Mills, explained. Particularly common in female friendships in our generation. We were raised to be caregivers, to nurture, to put others first. Some women internalize that as both their role and their value. When you're doing well, you're not fulfilling your role of needing them. You've broken the unspoken contract where you're supposed to be the one with problems they can help solve. But I still needed her, Margaret protested. David's heart attack. That's a real crisis. But in that crisis, you couldn't give her anything you needed to receive. For someone like Linda, who seems to derive her sense of worth from being needed, you needing genuine support short-circuits that dynamic. Dr. Mills leaned forward. Think about it this way. When did Linda seem most engaged with you? Most present? Margaret thought back. Linda had been most attentive during Margaret's pain. But had she been there for Margaret's joy? Margaret remembered telling Linda about Emma's engagement. Linda had been dismissive. When James got his dream job, Linda had found reasons to criticize it. When Margaret and David celebrated their 40th anniversary, Linda had been absent, claiming she was sick, though Margaret had seen her out to dinner 2 days later. She was there for my worst moments, Margaret said slowly, understanding dawning, but not my best ones. Exactly. And when you had both, when David's heart attack was a crisis, but you also still had the strong family support she lacked, she couldn't handle it. You were supposed to be broken by this. Instead, you had resources she doesn't have. That made your pain unusable to her. It was a horrible thought. But it fit. All of it fit. Margaret decided she needed closure. She needed to understand, from Linda herself, what had happened to their friendship. She sent a text. Linda, I need to see you. We need to talk in person. Can we meet for coffee? 3 days later, Linda responded, fine, Thursday at 2 p.m., the usual place. The usual place was a cafe where they'd met hundreds of times over the years. Margaret arrived early, her stomach churning with anxiety. When Linda walked in, she looked different somehow, harder, more guarded. They ordered coffee in silence, sat down at a corner table. The silence stretched. You wanted to talk, Linda finally said, her tone making it clear she considered this an imposition. I want to understand what happened to us, Margaret said, working to keep her voice calm. We've been best friends for 32 years. When David almost died, I needed you, and you weren't there. You didn't call back. You told me you needed space. I need to know why. Linda stirred her coffee with unnecessary vigor. I told you. I have my own life, my own problems. I know you do. And I've been there for all of them. Why couldn't you be there for me this once? Because, Margaret, not everything is about you. Linda's voice rose slightly, sharp with an anger that seemed to have been waiting to surface. You called me in the middle of the night, expecting me to drop everything, expecting me to rush to your side like I always do. David had a heart attack. That's not being dramatic, that's a real emergency. And it worked out fine, didn't it? Linda's eyes were cold. David's okay. Your perfect family rallied around you. Emma flew in, James drove up, everyone pulled together like they always do. You didn't need me. You have plenty of people. You're my best friend. Of course I needed you. I'm tired of being needed, Margaret. Linda's voice cracked. Do you know what it's like, being your friend? Perfect Margaret with her perfect marriage, and her perfect kids, and her perfect life? Do you know how exhausting it is to listen to you talk about your anniversary trips, and your grandchildren's accomplishments, and your husband's promotion, while my life is falling apart? Margaret sat back, stunned. I didn't know you felt that way. Why didn't you tell me? Because what was I supposed to say? Please stop being happy because it makes me feel bad about my divorce? You would have looked at me with those sympathetic eyes and told me I'd find happiness too. That things would get better, all the platitudes you always offer. I was trying to be supportive. You were trying to fix everything, make everything better, because that's what you do. But you can't fix my life, Margaret. You can't fix that Richard left me for a woman 20 years younger. You can't fix that I'm alone and broke while you're planning river cruises. You can't fix that your kids visit every month while mine barely call. So this is about jealousy, Margaret said quietly. You're jealous of my life. Linda's face flushed. Don't be ridiculous. Margaret, it's okay to... It's not jealousy. It's hard, okay? It's hard to be the friend with problems when you never have any. It's hard to always be the one who needs help while you're the one who has it all together. It's exhausting to maintain a friendship where the balance is so unequal. I don't have it all together, Margaret protested. I've struggled too. I had depression. I worried about my kids. My father died. And I was there for all of that. I listened. I supported you. But Margaret, you got through it. You always get through it with your loving husband and your therapy and your strong family system. You bounce back. I don't bounce back. I'm still trying to rebuild from Richard leaving 5 years ago, and you're off planning trips to Europe. Margaret felt anger rising to match Linda's. So because my life isn't as hard as yours, I don't deserve your support? Because I have a good marriage, I should apologize for it? Because my kids are involved in my life, I should feel guilty about that? That's not what I'm saying. That's exactly what you're saying. You're saying that our friendship only works when I'm the one struggling. When I'm down, you feel better about yourself. When I'm up, you resent me. That's not friendship, Linda. That's something else entirely. Linda's eyes filled with tears. You don't understand. You've never understood. You've always had everything easy. Easy? Margaret's voice rose. You think my life has been easy? I worked full-time while raising 2 kids. I took care of my father through his cancer. I struggled with depression for 3 years. David and I almost divorced in our 30s. Did you know that? We went to counseling for a year to save our marriage. Nothing about my life has been easy. I've just worked hard and been lucky and grateful for what I have. And I haven't worked hard? Linda shot back. You think I chose to have Richard leave me? You think I chose to have financial problems? You think I wanted my kids to move across the country? No, and I've never said that. I've been there for you through all of it. But you're punishing me because my hard times turned out differently than yours. That's not fair. They stared at each other across the table, years of unspoken resentment hanging in the air between them. Maybe, Linda said finally, her voice cold, we've just outgrown this friendship. People change. Circumstances change. Maybe we're just too different now. Margaret felt something break inside her chest, a final severing of the connection she'd treasured for 32 years. Maybe we are, Margaret said quietly. But Linda? Real friends are there for each other, in both the good times and the bad. Real friends don't keep score. Real friends don't abandon you during a crisis because they're jealous of your life. What we had, what I thought we had, that wasn't real friendship, at least not on your side. Linda stood up abruptly. I'm done with this conversation. I hope David continues to recover. Take care, Margaret. And she walked out of the cafe, leaving Margaret sitting alone with 2 cups of coffee growing cold. The weeks after that confrontation were harder than Margaret expected. She'd been prepared for it to hurt. She hadn't been prepared for it to feel like a death. In some ways, it was worse than a death. When someone dies, there's closure. There's a ritual. There's permission to grieve. People understand. But how do you explain to people that you're grieving a best friendship that ended not with tragedy, but with a cold realization that maybe it had never been what you thought it was? Are you and Linda fighting? Acquaintances would ask when they saw Margaret alone at events they'd usually attend together. We've grown apart, Margaret would say, because what else could she say? That her best friend had abandoned her during the scariest time of her life because she was jealous? She found herself going through the stages of grief. Denial. Maybe Linda would call, apologize, explain that she'd been going through something and hadn't meant any of it. Anger. How dare Linda throw away 3 decades over jealousy? How dare she make Margaret's crisis about herself? Bargaining. Maybe if Margaret reached out one more time, explained things differently, they could fix this. Depression. The loss of Linda left a hole in Margaret's daily life. No one to call with small observations. No one who shared decades of history. No one who remembered what Margaret's kids were like as toddlers, or what David looked like when they first married. And finally, slowly, acceptance. The friendship was over. Maybe it had been over for a long time, and Margaret had just been too invested in the history to notice it dying. Dr. Mills, from the grief support group, helped Margaret process what had happened. You're mourning the friendship you thought you had, and you're mourning the person you thought Linda was. Both of those things turned out to be different from reality. That's a profound loss. I keep wondering how I didn't see it sooner, Margaret said. All the signs were there. Why did I miss them? Because you're a loyal person. Because you value long-term relationships. Because you were invested in the story of your friendship. 32 years, best friends, through everything. That's a powerful narrative. It's hard to let go of a story you've been telling yourself for decades. I feel stupid. You're not stupid. You're trusting. Linda took advantage of that trust, consciously or unconsciously. That's on her, not you. Margaret thought about this. Was she always like this, or did she change? Maybe both. People can hold conflicting feelings. She let them fester until they poisoned the whole friendship. She said I never had problems, that I had everything easy. Did you share your struggles with her? Margaret thought back. I tried to. But now that I think about it, she'd either minimize them. That's not so bad. Or at least you have David. Or she'd change the subject. I learned not to talk about certain things because she couldn't handle them or wasn't interested. So the friendship existed on her terms. She needed you to fit a specific role. The helper, the supporter. When you stepped outside that role, when David's heart attack was serious enough that you genuinely needed help, but you also still had the strong family support she lacked, it broke the dynamic she'd been maintaining. Margaret felt tears coming. I really loved her. I really thought she was my best friend. I know. And that love was real, even if the friendship wasn't what you believed it to be. You can grieve that. You should grieve that. And Margaret did. She let herself feel the loss, the anger, the betrayal. She cried for the friendship that had never been as mutual as she'd believed. She cried for 32 years of showing up for someone who wouldn't show up for her when it mattered most. But as the weeks passed and David continued to recover, Margaret also began to notice something else. As Margaret stopped trying to maintain the friendship with Linda, stopped checking her phone hoping for an apology that would never come, stopped replaying their conversations looking for what she'd done wrong, space opened up in her life. And into that space came something unexpected. Other people. Diane, from the book club, started calling more often. Just checking in, she'd say. How's David? How are you? She brought over meals when she knew Margaret had doctor appointments. She sent funny text messages when Margaret was having hard days. A woman named Joyce from Margaret's literacy volunteer program reached out after hearing about David's heart attack. They started meeting for coffee. Joyce had been widowed 5 years earlier and understood the fear of possibly losing a spouse. They talked about real things: fear, grief, gratitude, the complexity of long marriages. Their conversations felt different from the ones Margaret had had with Linda, more balanced, more honest. Her neighbor, Susan, whom Margaret had always been friendly with but never particularly close to, started showing up with small kindnesses. A loaf of homemade bread. an invitation to walk their dogs together. "I know what it's like," Susan said. "When Tom had his stroke, I learned who my real friends were." The surprising part was, they weren't always the people I expected. Even in her grief support group, Margaret formed connections. Women who understood betrayal, who'd experienced similar losses, who didn't judge her for grieving a friendship. And, perhaps most surprisingly, Margaret's relationship with her daughter Emma deepened. Emma started calling more often, not just to check on David, but to really talk about her own marriage, her fears, her dreams, her struggles with balancing work and parenting. "I always felt like I couldn't talk to you about the hard stuff," Emma admitted one evening over FaceTime. "Because you and Linda were so close, and I didn't want to bother you." "Bother me?" "Emma, you're my daughter. You could never bother me." "I know, but Linda was always there, always the priority. I felt like I was competing for your attention sometimes." Margaret felt a pang of guilt. Had she prioritized Linda over her own daughter? Looking back, honestly, maybe she had. All those evenings devoted to Linda's crises. All those phone calls that went on for hours while Emma's calls were kept short because Linda's having a hard time. All those times she'd canceled plans with Emma because Linda needed something. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I didn't realize." "It's okay, Mom. I understood Linda was your best friend. But now, I don't know, maybe this sounds selfish, but I'm kind of glad to have more of you." Margaret felt tears welling up. "It's not selfish at all. And I'm glad too. I've missed you." They talked for 2 hours that night. Really talked, in a way they hadn't since Emma was a teenager. And when they hung up, Margaret realized something. She'd been so focused on maintaining a friendship that was draining her, that she'd neglected relationships that could actually nourish her. 3 months after the confrontation at the cafe, Margaret was having lunch with Joyce and Diane. They'd formed an unexpected trio, meeting weekly to talk and laugh and support each other. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said. "What makes a real friendship? I thought I knew, but obviously I didn't." Joyce set down her fork, considering. "For me, it's reciprocity. Not like keeping score, but a natural back and forth. Sometimes I need more, sometimes you need more, but over time it balances out. Neither person is always the giver or always the taker." "And honesty," Diane added. "Being able to say, 'I'm struggling with jealousy,' or 'I'm going through something and can't be there for you right now,' instead of just disappearing or being passive-aggressive. Being there for the good and the bad," Joyce continued. "Real friends celebrate your wins without resentment. They don't need you to be struggling to feel close to you." Margaret thought about this. Linda could only handle my struggles, not my successes. And even my struggles had to be the right kind. Bad enough that she felt needed, but not so bad that I couldn't still support her. "That's exhausting," Diane said. "Real friendship shouldn't require you to dim your light so someone else feels better about themselves." "I think," Joyce said slowly, "the biggest difference is this. Real friends want what's best for you, even if it's hard for them. Even if your happiness brings up their own pain. They deal with those feelings themselves instead of punishing you for them." Margaret nodded, thinking of how Linda had essentially punished her for having a strong marriage. Involved children, financial security, none of those things were Margaret's fault, and yet Linda had held them against her. "I spent 32 years in a friendship where I was always auditioning," Margaret said, the realization crystallizing. "Always trying to be the right amount of successful but not too successful. Always being supportive but not expecting support back. Always grateful Linda tolerated my happiness. That's not friendship." "No," Joyce agreed. "That's codependency. Or a one-sided relationship where you existed to meet her needs." Over the following weeks, Margaret began to see her other relationships more clearly too. She had lunch with an old colleague, Barbara, who spent the entire time complaining about her life, but never asked how Margaret was doing. When Margaret tried to mention David's recovery, Barbara interrupted with her own health complaints. Margaret suddenly saw the pattern. Barbara, like Linda, only wanted Margaret around as an audience for her problems. At the end of lunch, when Barbara said, "We should do this again soon," Margaret surprised herself by saying, "Actually, Barbara, I don't think so. Take care." Barbara looked shocked, but Margaret felt liberated. She didn't owe anyone her time and energy, especially people who didn't reciprocate. She also began noticing the people who did show up authentically. Susan, who called just to chat, no agenda, no crisis, just friendly connection. Diane, who remembered David's follow-up appointments and texted to ask how they went. Joyce, who sent articles Margaret might find interesting and remembered small details from their conversations. These friendships felt different. Lighter. Easier. More mutual. Margaret also joined a watercolor painting class she'd been interested in for years, but had never pursued because Linda had dismissed it as a waste of money. In the class, she met Helen, a retired architect who was sharp and funny and had no interest in competing or comparing. "I like you," Helen said after their third class. "You're genuine. No drama, no games. Want to get coffee sometime?" "I'd like that," Margaret said, and meant it. Their friendship developed naturally, organically. They talked about art, and books, and politics, and their families. When Margaret mentioned David's heart attack, Helen listened with genuine concern, and then shared her own experience with her mother's stroke. They talked about fear, and mortality, and gratitude. The conversation flowed easily, back and forth, both of them contributing, both of them listening. It felt like what friendship should be. 6 months after the confrontation at the cafe, Margaret ran into Linda at the grocery store. Her heart jumped when she saw Linda coming around the corner of the cereal aisle, and for a split second, old instincts kicked in. The impulse to smile, to rush over, to act like nothing had happened. But Margaret stayed where she was. Linda saw her, froze, and for a moment they just looked at each other across a distance that felt both physical and vast. Linda looked older, Margaret thought. Tired. There were new lines around her mouth, a stoop to her shoulders that hadn't been there before. "Margaret," Linda said, her voice uncertain. "Linda." Silence. A woman pushed a cart between them, oblivious to the tension. "How's David?" Linda asked finally. "He's doing well, almost fully recovered." "That's good. I'm glad." More silence. Margaret waited, some part of her still hoping Linda might apologize, might explain, might say something that would make sense of everything. Instead, Linda said, "I heard you joined some painting class. That's nice." "I'm enjoying it." "And you've been spending time with Diane and Joyce." There was something in Linda's tone. Not quite accusation, but not quite neutral either. Ownership, maybe. As if Margaret's other friendships were somehow a betrayal. Margaret felt something shift inside her. Not anger this time, but a sort of calm clarity. "Linda, can I ask you something? If you could go back, would you do anything differently? Would you have called me back when David was in the hospital?" Linda's face tightened. "I don't know, maybe." "But Margaret, you have to understand." "No," Margaret interrupted gently. "I don't think I do have to understand. I've spent months trying to understand, trying to see it from your perspective, trying to figure out what I did wrong. But I didn't do anything wrong. I had a good marriage, and you resented it. My kids stayed close, and you resented it. I was happy sometimes, and you couldn't handle it. That's not on me. That's on you." "You're being unfair," Linda protested, but her voice was weak. "Am I? You abandoned me during the worst crisis of my life, because you were jealous. That's what happened. And instead of apologizing or trying to make it right, you're standing here saying, 'Must be nice,' about my new friendships like I've done something wrong by finding people who actually show up for me." Linda's eyes filled with tears. "I was your best friend for 32 years. "You were," Margaret agreed. "But Linda, I don't think you were ever my friend. I think I was your audience, your support system, your emotional caretaker. And when I needed you to be those things for me, just once, you couldn't do it." "That's not true. I cared about you." "Maybe you did in your way. But caring isn't enough. Love isn't enough. Real friendship requires showing up, even when it's hard. You never did that. You just expected me to make myself smaller so you could feel bigger. Linda was crying openly now. You don't know what it's been like for me. You don't know how hard. You're right, Margaret said softly. I don't, because you never really let me in. You only let me see the parts that made me useful to you. She picked up her shopping basket. I hope you find what you need, Linda. I really do. I hope you find peace and happiness. But I can't be part of your life anymore. It wasn't good for me. It took me 62 years and a health crisis to realize that, but I know it now. So that's it? 32 years and you're just walking away? No, Margaret said. You walked away 6 months ago when you didn't call me back. I'm just finally accepting it. She walked past Linda, her heart pounding, and continued her shopping. When she glanced back, Linda was still standing in the cereal aisle, crying. Margaret felt sad, but not guilty. There was a difference. That evening, Margaret sat with David on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. I saw Linda today, she told him. David reached for her hand. How was that? Hard, sad, but also freeing in a way. I finally said what I needed to say. Good for you. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. This was what 41 years of marriage looked like, Margaret thought. The ability to be quiet together. The trust that you didn't have to fill every silence with words. Can I tell you something? David asked. I never liked Linda. Margaret looked at him in surprise. What? Why didn't you say something? Because she was your best friend. Because you loved her. Because it wasn't my place to interfere. But I always thought she took advantage of you. You were always doing things for her, always available when she needed something, always making excuses for her when she couldn't show up for you. Why didn't I see it? David squeezed her hand. Because you're loyal. Because you value history and commitment. Because you wanted to believe in the friendship. Those aren't bad qualities, Maggie. They just meant you stayed longer than you should have. 32 years longer, Margaret said wryly. Or maybe exactly as long as you needed to. Maybe you needed those 32 years to learn what you learned. Maybe you needed Linda to show her true colors during the crisis so you could finally see clearly. Margaret thought about this. Do you think she was always jealous? Or did it develop over time? I think it was always there, David said. But it got worse after Richard left her. Seeing us still together, still happy, still planning a future, it was salt in her wound. She couldn't be happy for us because your happiness highlighted what she'd lost. That's so sad. It is. But it's also not your responsibility to manage her feelings by pretending to be less happy than you are. Margaret leaned her head on David's shoulder. I've been thinking about what real friendship looks like. Joyce and Diane and Helen, they're so different from Linda. They're actually interested in my life. They show up. They can handle it when I'm happy. Because they're secure in themselves, David said. They don't need you to be struggling to feel valuable. They can celebrate your joy without it diminishing theirs. I think I chose wrong for a long time, Margaret admitted. I prioritized a friendship that was draining me over relationships that could nourish me. You didn't choose wrong. You chose with the information you had. And now you know better, so you're choosing differently. That's growth, not failure. They watched the sun sink lower, the sky deepening to purple. You know what's weird? Margaret said. I thought losing Linda would leave this huge hole in my life. And it did, for a while. But the hole is filling up with better things. Deeper conversations with Emma. More time for painting. Friendships with people who actually reciprocate. It's like I decluttered my life, and now there's room for what really matters. Linda was clutter? David asked with a slight smile. In a way, yes. She took up so much space, so much emotional energy, so much time, so much worry about whether I was being a good enough friend to her. Now that space is available for relationships that actually give back. So what's the lesson? David asked. After all this, what have you learned? Margaret thought carefully. That friendship, real friendship, isn't about longevity. 32 years doesn't mean much if the foundation was never solid. Real friendship is about mutuality, honesty, showing up for both the good and the bad. It's about being able to celebrate each other's joy without resentment. It's about reciprocity and respect, and actually caring about each other's lives, not just using each other to meet your own needs. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is walk away from people who don't know how to be friends, even if you've known them for decades. History isn't a reason to accept mistreatment. David kissed the top of her head. I'm proud of you. I know this has been hard. It has been. But David, I think I'm okay. Actually, more than okay. I think I'm better. 1 year later, Margaret stood in front of her easel in the community art studio, adding touches of blue to a watercolor landscape. Around her, other members of the class worked on their own projects. Soft classical music played in the background. The atmosphere was peaceful, creative, communal. That's beautiful, Margaret, Helen said, looking over from her own painting. The way you captured the light on the water. Stunning. Thank you. I'm finally feeling like I'm getting the hang of this. After class, Margaret, Helen, Joyce, and Diane went to their favorite cafe, a new ritual they'd established over the past year. I have news, Joyce announced as they settled in with their drinks. I'm going on a date. The table erupted in excited questions. Joyce, blushing and laughing, told them about a man she'd met at the library, a retired professor who'd asked her to dinner. I'm terrified, she admitted. I haven't dated since my husband died. You'll be wonderful, Diane assured her. And you'll tell us all about it afterward. They talked and laughed for an hour, the conversation flowing easily from Joyce's date to Diane's granddaughter's birthday party, to Helen's upcoming art show, to Margaret's plans for Thanksgiving. At one point, Helen asked, Margaret, you've seemed really happy lately. What's your secret? Margaret thought about it. I think I finally learned to surround myself with people who want me to be happy. That sounds simple, but it's not. For years, I invested in a friendship with someone who could only love me when I was struggling. Now I have people in my life who celebrate my joy, who show up for me, who give as much as they take. It's made all the difference. To real friendship, Diane said, raising her coffee cup. To real friendship, they echoed, clinking cups. Later that evening, Margaret was cooking dinner with David when her phone buzzed. A text from Linda. Her heart still jumped a little when she saw the name. The message read, I saw your painting in the art show display at the library. It's really good. I'm sorry about everything. I miss you. Can we talk? Margaret stared at the message for a long moment. A year ago, even 6 months ago, she might have said yes, might have agreed to meet, hoping Linda had changed, hoping they could repair what was broken. But now she understood something she hadn't before. Some things can't be repaired. Some relationships are fundamentally flawed from the beginning, and no amount of history can fix a broken foundation. She thought about what a conversation with Linda would look like. Linda would probably apologize, but would she have really changed? Would she be able to celebrate Margaret's joy in her new friendships, her painting, her life? Or would the old resentment, the old jealousy, the old patterns resurface the first time Margaret shared good news? More importantly, did Margaret want to go backward to investigate that possibility when she'd built something so much better going forward? She showed the text to David. What do you want to do? He asked. I think I want to let it go. Not with anger, just with acceptance. That friendship, it ran its course, and I'm okay with that. Margaret typed, thank you for the kind words about my painting. I've thought about your message, and I think it's best if we leave the past in the past. I wish you well, Linda. I really do. But I'm in a different place now. Take care. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. Are you okay? David asked. Yeah, Margaret said, and meant it. I really am. That night, as Margaret got ready for bed, she thought about the journey of the past year. She'd lost a best friend of 32 years. But in that loss, she'd gained clarity about what real friendship looked like. She'd gained deeper relationships with her daughter, better boundaries, a creative outlet that brought her joy, and a circle of women who genuinely cared about her. She'd learned that you can be 62 years old and still have important lessons to learn about relationships, that sometimes the people we think are our closest friends are actually the ones holding us back. that loyalty to history shouldn't outweigh honesty about present reality. Most importantly, she'd learned that it's never too late to choose better for yourself. The phone buzzed one more time. Linda, I understand. I hope you're happy. Margaret didn't respond. She turned off her phone, kissed David goodnight, and fell asleep in the home she'd built over 41 years of marriage, surrounded by new watercolor paintings on the walls and plans for lunch with real friends tomorrow. She was happy, finally, genuinely happy. And she'd gotten there by learning one of life's hardest lessons. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for others, is to let go.